thank you very much, everybody, for coming this extraordinarily sunny and warm day to delve deep into the darkness and stormy weather, political weather in Latin America. We're doing our best with, believe it or not, the AC is at full blast, but we might resort to radical measures if, like opening the windows if need. So the timing of this event, despite the weather being more conducive for outside activities, the timing is quite propitious because a few weeks ago we saw a momentous occasion in Brazil with Lula da Silva, one of the most popular and perhaps iconic political figures in Latin America, going to jail on a corruption charge. Last weekend, we saw the Summit of the Americas center, a lot of Venezuela, but nominally on the issue of corruption and taking place in a country where the president was had to resign 3 weeks prior because of a corruption scandal. Even Cuba is facing change now. The power transition yesterday, Raul Castro passing the baton to someone else for the first time since 1959. Although that's not technically an election. Elsewhere in the continent, large democracies that once seemed stable and we all here heard the narratives about the rising powers in Latin America, the rise in Brazil, the rise in Mexico, now seeing faced by uncertainty and the rise of anti-establishment and often radical candidates. So in Brazil, the presidential race for October is unusually up in the air for this time of the year, with a far-right candidate as one of the leading contenders, and indeed with Lula out of the race, apparently. Jair Bolsonaro, the far-right candidate, is now technically leading the polls with around 17% of the vote. And in Mexico is the far left that worries some business communities and also promises a hard fight against the already bellicose Donald Trump far on the north. So fortunately, I will not be taking on this very difficult task of putting together these narratives of disruption, but rather I have a fantastic panel with me. So Michael Reed, I will not read the profiles because they are far too extensive for the purposes of this lunch hour meeting. Michael Reed is the Bello columnist and senior editor for Latin America at The Economist. Ivan Briscoe is the director for Latin America and the Caribbean at the International Crisis Group. And Carla McRoberts is managing director of Veracity and a trustee of Cunning House. So we will explore several the issues of political disruption and corruption through several lenses, and I believe Ivan will also touch on the perhaps security and peace implications of the political developments in Colombia and elsewhere. And we'll also touch on the implications for business, the private sector, and other economic measures. So it will be quite comprehensive, and we'll have plenty of discussion afterwards because obviously we will not be able to touch on all the issues. And this meeting is on the record. So if I could start with Michael, please.
Thank you very much, Antonio. Can I ask you for some water?
Of course.
Given the weather. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's great to be here. And thank you for organising the Brazilian weather, which is an unexpected bonus for a visit to London in April. I have sort of 15 minutes, I think, to talk about the future.
Well, 10.
The future of countries where about 450 to 500 million people live. So I'm going to have to be extremely schematic. Let me start by noting that this year is actually the 40th anniversary of the arrival of what Samuel Huntington called the third wave of democratization, which had begun with the Portuguese Revolution. Its arrival in Latin America in the Dominican Republic in 1978. And if we look at the big picture, in a world where since 2005 democracy has been in retreat, according to Freedom House and various academics and so on, I think it's held up, despite all the problems, despite the concerns about quality, it's held up reasonably well in Latin America. There are only two clear cases of democratic regress and the slide into dictatorship, Venezuela and Nicaragua. there are two question marks. I mean, will Evo Morales allow himself to be voted freely out of office next year in Bolivia? Honduras, I think, is a question mark as well, where Juan Orlando Hernandez, according to his opponents, stole an election in which he shouldn't have been able to be a candidate. But that apart, I think it has held up reasonably well in the region. But the region is embarking, well, between November 2017 and December 2019, 12 countries will hold presidential elections. And I exclude from that list Venezuela because the word election means a choice, and I don't think of what we know today there will be a free and fair choice in Venezuela, but it will hold some kind of vote. Unfortunately, this electoral marathon is taking place in rather unpropitious circumstances. Latin Americans in many places are angry, cynical, and pissed off, not to put too fine a point on it, for three main reasons. One is that the region's economies, on the whole, have been pretty mediocre for the last few years after the great boom of 2003 to 2012, which was associated with a lot of social progress and the expansion of the middle class and a steep fall in poverty. That has gone slightly into reverse in the last few years. We've seen severe slump in Brazil, which is now ending, even worse in Venezuela. The IMF expects overall growth of 2% this year, but if one looks at the countries that are holding elections in this period, only in Paraguay and Bolivia is growth expected to be at over 4%, and in fact in both those cases it's at 4%, the forecast. Associated with that economic performance is a frustration of that expanded middle class whose expectations were raised. And there's been a decline in security, and Ivan is going to talk in detail about security, so I won't say any more, but it is a big concern in several countries. And then thirdly, there has been the spectre of corruption, both the reality and the perception, symbolized or epitomized by Odebrecht, the Brazilian construction company that has admitted paying bribes of $700 million in 10 Latin American countries. And the perception of corruption has led to a widespread discredit of the political class, of democratic politics. Now, in that voter mood, clearly there is a risk that Latin Americans in some countries will turn to saviors, populists, outsiders, etc. And that, in turn, can lead to instability. But it's important to say there are other factors at work in the region as well. That's not the only thing that's going on. I will highlight three. The first is the ebbing of the so-called pink tide in South America, of the hegemony of governments to the left of centre. If we look at the legislative election in Argentina in October, Mauricio Macri with the centre-right coalition managed to win it and to strengthen his position in the Congress. Then in Chile, Sebastián Piñera won fairly handsomely in the end, in the second round. And I think it's important to note that, I mean, if you speak to people who are advising his opponent Alejandro Guiller, they said that the reason that Guiller lost is that he positioned himself, or he was seen as, to the left of Bachelet, who had been to herself to the left of her first, of herself in her first term, and some 800,000 Chileans went out to vote for Piñera in the second round, who hadn't voted for him in the first round, because they were worried about instability. And so anger may be more visible, but I think fear is actually an important factor in these elections as well, fear of adventurism. Second factor is political fragmentation, which is a worldwide trend with the discredit of traditional parties. We see it in Spain, where I live at the moment, and in Italy, and we see it in Latin America. And in Latin America, it matters more because of Latin America's unique and uniquely difficult combination of directly elected executive presidents on the one hand, and legislatures elected by proportional representation on the other. So presidents run the risk of not having a majority, and that can lead to instability, as we've just seen with the eviction of Kuczynski in Peru. That fragmentation in Latin America is partly because of the emergence of new cleavages, and let me just highlight one, which is the cluster of issues around gender, sexuality and personal behaviour, which is associated to some extent with the rise of evangelical Protestantism in Latin America. 20% of Latin Americans are now Protestants, according to the Pew Research Centre, compared with 4% in 1970. And some of them have made this a so-called wedge issue, and we saw that in Costa Rica, where in a consolidated democracy, for the first time since 1948, neither of the two traditional parties that underpinned it got into the second round, and we saw this evangelical pastor getting there and losing, but he got there. Now I will use the rest of my limited time to look at three of the elections in a bit more detail: Mexico, Colombia, and Brazil, the three most populous countries in the region. If you look at Mexico, which is the first one, on July the 1st, the background is a profound disillusion with the status quo. The issues in Mexico are crime, corruption, and the mediocre economy, and not Trump, who has not actually figured so far, for my change, as an issue in the election. There's a profound sense that both the PRI of President Enrique Peña Nieto and the PAN of the previous two presidents failed, and that, above all else, is why Andrés Manuel López Obrador, this nationalist populist of the left, is much better placed to win this time than he was in 2006 or 2012. Remember that there's no second round in Mexico, which means that no runoff, which means that you, in a fragmented political system as it now is, you can win with 30-35% of the vote, and the polls give him rather more than that. He's made fewer mistakes than he made in the past in terms of gaps. I don't think he's won yet. I think I know this is on the record, but this is my personal view, and I've written it. I think the PRI is doing everything possible to stop Ricardo Anaya, his opponent, Ricardo Anaya, the candidate of the front, the coalition between Conservative PAN and the centre-left PRD, to stop him from winning, because Anaya has the best chance of stopping López Obrador, because rejection of the Peña Nieto government is extremely high. Anaya represents the rule of law. The PRI have used the government to try and smear him, and that's had some effect. But the debates will be quite important. Anaya is a very good debater. The first debate, I think, is on Sunday. So it's not over yet. I think López Obrador is clearly a strong favourite, but it's not over. What would a López Obrador victory mean? I don't think it means that Mexico becomes Venezuela, but I do think it means a backward step for Mexico, both economically and politically. López Obrador's kind of political formation was in the PRI of Luis Echeverría in the 1970s, a kind of free-spending, populist, leftist, nationalist version of the PRI, and that's really his political core. And I think there would be some repetition of that. I think he would test Mexico's rather weak checks and balances on executive power, because Mexican democracy is still pretty new. The fact that he said he wanted to have a recall referendum on his performance every 2 years worries me, because it is set in stone in Mexico that you get 6 years and you do not have re-election. If you start suggesting that you should be assessed every 2 years, then you are opening the way towards reconsidering no re-election. I think he would also, in the sort of geopolitical, diplomatic picture, he would offer a lifeline to Venezuela and to Cuba, to their governments. Very quickly on Colombia, it's a paradox that the outgoing president, Juan Manuel Santos, has been hailed around the world, praised around the world for the peace agreement with the FARC above all, but also for his environmental policies and so on. But he's actually pretty unpopular at home and has been for quite a long time. Partly because the peace deal is not terribly popular, as you know, and secondly because the whiff of corruption, not particularly around, well, not around him and not particularly around his government, but in general. And thirdly because the economy has been mediocre for the last 2 to 3 years. So it's not surprising that opponents of Santos to the left and the right look as if they will be the two that make it to the second round. There will be a second round in a context of more fragmentation than in the past in Colombia. So you have Iván Duque on the right, who is the candidate of Álvaro Uribe, very popular still, former president, but he is not Álvaro Uribe. He's a much more moderate man of much more moderate temperament. And then you have Gustavo Petro on the left, who's former guerrilla of the M19, former mayor of Bogota, somewhat populist, one-time Chavista fellow traveller. I think Duque will win that contest, but I mean, we'll see. Then lastly, Brazil. The first thing to say about Brazil is whatever you read, it's simply too early to tell. I mean, Brazilian elections are usually not decided until about June, July, and the polls crystallize that. This one will be decided even later than usual because of fragmentation. And it's only in late July that we will know who are the candidates and what coalitions they will have. And that second part is very important. I think what effect will the jailing of Lula have? I think the net effect, there are two net effects. One is to increase the fragmentation even further, because his 30 to 35% of the vote, some of it will go to whoever he names, and I do assume he won't be a candidate, by the way, we can talk about that. Some of it will go to two far left candidates who might get 5 or 6% each, and some of it could go to Ciro Gomes, a kind of soft left, soft populist, soft developmentalist, who has a chance of getting to the second round, I think, of the runoff. Some of it might go to Marina Silva, that's what the poll last weekend suggested, former Environment Minister candidate last 2 elections. But she has a series of almost insurmountable difficulties, I think, to be a candidate. I mean, she has a very small party. As things stand, she wouldn't even be invited to the debates. And she buckled last time, partly because she came under very strong and disloyal attack from the Workers' Party. And, you know, I don't think she can make it. I think the other net effect is that it's bad for Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro, this former army captain, 7-term congressman, so he's not an outsider. He's a man of extreme right views, very macho, misogynist discourse. In Brazil, which is traditionally a country of moderate politics, he would normally have no chance. The fact that he is where he is, about 15 to 70% of the polls, shows how much damage has been done to the socio-political fabric of Brazil by the recession and its associated problems. Bolsonaro positioned himself as the anti-Lula, and if Lula's not there, I think part of his appeal fades. I think it's also difficult for him that Joaquim Barbosa, a former president of the Supreme Court, wants to run, maybe a candidate. If Bolsonaro represents order, but without law, I think Barbosa could make a reasonable pitch to represent law and order. So there are half a dozen candidates who could get to the second round. There's also Gerardo Alckmin of Fernando Henrique Cardoso's party, the Social Democratic Party. Centre-right, long-time governor of Sao Paulo, very solid, very boring. Can he, described by the Eurasia Group as the Hillary Clinton of Brazilian politics, which sounds like the kiss of death. But But he has certain advantages, and one shouldn't write him off here. So the big question is this going to be a normal Brazilian election, or is it not going to be? If it's a normal Brazilian election, then three things count, apart from the identity of the candidate. Resources, money, and the rules have changed. No corporate donations this time, only public money and private individual donations, of which there's no tradition in Brazil. And public money will be carved up according to the strength of your coalition in the lower house of Congress. Second thing is party machines. There are only three parties that have nationwide party machines. ALP means the Workers' Party, and TEMA's MDB. And then the third thing that traditionally counts is the free TV time, which again is divided up according to the strength of your coalition in the lower house of Congress. So that all counts against Bolsonaro, against Marina Silva, etc. The question is, to what extent is this not a normal election? Is it a postmodern election in which voter cynicism and social media are going to be more important than those traditional factors? My sense is it's going to be half and half, actually, and I think candidates from the centre left, the centre right, more with gradations of sort of soft populism in there, will get through to the second round. And I will say now that Bolsonaro will not be the next president of Brazil. If I'm wrong, I'll go into exile, but not in Brazil. So to sum up, I think these elections are terribly important, and they're much more difficult to read than many in the past. They're terribly important because to return to faster economic growth and the social progress that the region needs, Latin America needs coherent governments with a clear mandate to undertake difficult reforms. And will we see that? I mean, the fragmentation makes it harder, it doesn't make it impossible. I think Mauricio Macri is emerging in Argentina as a good example, which the region needs. And I would say that, for me, one of the most hopeful things is that civil society in Latin America is much more organised than it used to be, and it wants democracy. Now, civil society is not a panacea, but it is an important factor, and with that I'll stop.
Thank you very much, Michael.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Antonio. Thank you for coming on this day when you could be doing many more interesting things. I concur exactly with what Michael has said, and I just want to go back to one of his comments because it was reflected in a very interesting column just written a few days ago by a Mexican author, Jorge Cepeda Patterson, saying, at the moment there is rage and fear in Mexican society, but rage is a lot stronger than fear. And that is exactly the context which we're seeing in terms of the rise. It seems to be unassailable, the position which Andrés Manuel López Obrador currently has in the polls. That could change. I'll come a little bit to what could change that later. But he is scoring a lot of political goals because the goal is not being defended and is open wide. There are some points where he is a populist. One has to accept there are risks with a possible AMLO presidency. But at the same time, campaigning and saying that he would double the minimum wage as one of his first decisions, when the minimum wage in Mexico is the third lowest in Latin America, in one of Latin America's biggest economies, it should have said, where it's actually earning the minimum wage on a full working week is lower, below the poverty line, is one of those things which gives him, a huge head of steam in the polls, and which we find it's very hard for the PRI to get any grip on him. Also, obviously, campaigning on corruption, where corruption levels are self-evident in Mexico, bearing in mind, of course, that we know what Odebrecht spent around Latin America because Odebrecht executives confessed everything to the courts. We know where the $800 million went in those years of Odebrecht corruption. 10 million or so went to Mexico. There is no serious criminal investigation underway in Mexico. Likewise, there is no serious criminal investigation underway in Venezuela, whereas it has brought down presidents, a president in Peru, a vice president in Ecuador, and obviously caused huge damage through the scandals in other countries. So this is the context in which it is difficult for more centrist establishment politicians to stop these populist outsiders, because they are pulling on a huge well of public disgruntlement, and I totally agree. The question for me is whether these levels of public discontent and the political tensions, polarization which they're generating, obviously in Colombia, obviously in Brazil and in Mexico, can be appropriately handled and processed through the ballot box. And there are risks associated with this. Now, I'm not going to say that any of these risks is bound to happen, is a cast iron certainty, but it's best to be aware of them, because there are grounds to believe that before, during and after these polls, there are a number of issues, particularly in the dimensions of security and stability, which we could see emerge. First is violence. Now, you may say that these are peaceful political processes. The March 11th legislative elections in Colombia were the most peaceful for years. Taking part in those elections for the first time ever was the political party which came out of the peace accord 2016 from the FARC guerrillas. The party was called the FARC. It did astonishingly badly in the polls, but so did the party which inherited the mantle of the paramilitary forces, also taking part in the elections, Opción Ciudadana. So you see that there are good reasons for thinking, well, these are more peaceful elections than ever. But at the same time, what we are also witnessing in Colombia and in Mexico, and to a lesser extent in Brazil, but emerging in Brazil, is attacks, violent attacks on what you might call the proto-political class, people who are coming up into politics, but through the communities, through mobilization, through the local level activities, but are being denied space, largely through the interaction between political classes and criminal groups. In Mexico, and this is something which has not really been made public, but to me it's extraordinary. According to the latest count, 78 political candidates and family members have been killed since September, particularly, again, at the local level, and particularly in areas where there is a high level of criminal penetration in political establishments. We know in Colombia over 200 local community and social leaders killed since the peace accord was signed in December 2016. Many of them leaders of what are called Juntos de Acción Comunal, so local community organizing bodies. And again, campaigning on issues of land, of community rights, coca substitution programs, and obviously sparking fears amongst powerful local interests. In Brazil, we haven't seen the same extent of this phenomenon, but of course the recent and very brutal murder of Marielle Franco, I think, gave cause for concern as to what could happen in the future there. And she is very much a model of someone from the community grassroots trying to break into a political system, very much trying to defend itself from challenges. The second concern relates to what you might call the instrumental politicised use of state institutions, judicial institutions and electoral institutions to steer the course of the election. Now here we're in a very tricky ground, because there are facts and there are perceptions of facts, and there's a grey area between them where it's difficult to say exactly what is what. But the example we have to hold on to, the worry, is Honduras. We saw in Honduras that a disputed election, a vote count that was very poorly handled, to be honest, led very quickly, when it seemed that the government was actually turning the results around in its favour, President Juan Orlando Hernández, led to immediate unrest, immediate public ire, 10-day curfew, and killing of several dozen people afterwards. And now the long-term effect we're seeing is a spike, a really incredible spike in the rise of Honduran migrants leaving the country and trying to get to the United States. What happened in Honduras? I think that the most authoritative version of that is actually the EU Electoral Observation Mission's report, which it says, well, the votes cast were the votes counted. All the parties had tallies, sheets, which they signed off on. and the votes which were counted in the central body, the TSE, the Tribunal Supremo Electoral, were the same as the ones which were on the sheets which the different parties had. But the problem was that electoral authority had been voted by Congress some years ago amongst a group of parties. Its members were representative of those parties, not of the opposition groups. There was a huge imbalance in spending of resources, huge imbalance in access to media, and the people who were very discontented for all the typical reasons which Michael has discussed, shared across much of Latin America, thought, well, this is being stolen from us. We're seeing the levels of political control over the key institutions, and now they are mishandling and rigging the very vote. The people thought they were robbed. And when this occurs in an election, when there's that perception of the election being stolen, it is a trigger for violence and unrest. We saw something similar in Mexico in 2006. Again, the evidence that it was robbed from López Obrador at that time is, not overwhelming, but it's a question of the perception. Right now, in Latin America, we have one very clear example of a rigged election system, the extreme example, which is why we don't really call it an election, which is what will happen in Venezuela in May. We saw the Constituent Assembly poll with an alleged 1 million votes for government deputies, as it were, created out of nowhere. We saw a blatant fraud in one of the regional polls in the regional elections in October. And what we're seeing now is this very sinister but quite cunning use by the government of its official ID cards, Carne de la Patria, which are used to distribute pensions, used to distribute food rations. You have to sign up to get this scannable card. And also you are increasingly being asked to scan it around the polling station so they know who is coming in and out of the polling stations. It's revealing in Latino Barometro that Venezuela has the lowest number of people who, when they go to vote, actually think their ballot is secret. 45% think their ballot is secret. Most think the government knows what they're voting for. So that gives you a clear idea of where the situation is in Venezuela. But it's not nearly that bad in Brazil and Mexico, but the grounds for public suspicion are there. I mean, people look at the arrest of Lula, whether it's justified or not, whether it's good or not that he's in jail. They are asking, and what about Mr. Alckmin? And what about the current president who had Congress lifting the threat of prosecution against him twice last year, if I'm not mistaken, or any other number of candidates who are not going through the same process? In Mexico, I mean, it's slightly worrying, to say the least, that the head of the Electoral Prosecution Unit, who raised the issue of Odebrecht funding of Peña Nieta's campaign in 2002, was summarily sacked immediately after last year. It's worrying that the Electoral Court suddenly accepts an independent candidate coming in, El Bronco, accepted to be put on the ballot sheets like that without there being any proof that he had the right requisite number of signatures, with grave doubts over the process, it being perceived as an effort to chip away at AMLO's voting lead. These issues, they might seem small and minor and not very important, but they could be incredibly consequential if it comes down to a very narrow margin of victory when that process is contested by a large number of people, given the level of discontent in the country. Just two more points. One is about illicit financing. Obviously, we know illicit financing has been a huge problem. We know about Odebrecht. We know about many other scandals around Latin America. There have been a lot of laws passed in recent years to try and restrict this. You mentioned the question of the Brazilian cap or the ban on corporate donations. There's a clean politics law which was passed in Honduras. Mexico passed quite a vanguard electoral financing law in 2014. But the worry is now, again, it's the local level. It's the vote buying at the local level. It's the fact that, let's take the example of El Salvador. When there was talk of reaching a negotiation or an arrangement with the gangs, bringing down levels of insecurity, then there was also evidence that both parties immediately started, political parties, immediately started speaking to the gangs and seeing whether those gangs could deliver votes from their constituencies. And that's not just El Salvador. In Brazil, that's an increasing concern, I believe, as well. And we know that the levels of vote buying in Colombia remain incredibly high. It's about $20 is the going rate for your vote. And one takes a photo of one's vote with a mobile phone. They pay you half before and half after. And this is a very common phenomenon. But lastly, I want to talk about outcomes for possible security and peace in the region. I mean, the Colombian election is obviously the one where you would say, the probable victor is Ivan Duque. He's ahead in the polls. He seems to be quite a moderate, technocratic candidate. Yes, there's no doubt about that. But his line on the peace agreement is not going to be well received by the FARC. He's talked about amalgamating all the high courts in the land, including the special jurisdiction of peace. He doesn't want any FARC leaders who are still facing prosecution in the transitional justice system to be able to run as candidates. He is obviously not very interested in the negotiations with other guerrilla group, and he's got a very hard line on Venezuela. So there are lots of issues there. In more immediate term is what's going to happen on the Colombian-Venezuela border area. We know there's a huge migration and humanitarian crisis at the moment. The latest figures we're seeing is 5,000 Venezuelans passing every day across the border, where we're seeing high levels of violence and crime, we're seeing diseases spreading. But we're having this chain of elections. Venezuela on May the 20th, Colombia first round a week later, Colombia second round a few weeks after that. The risk in this context that some of these hostilities between the two countries, the rhetorical hostility, will in some way exacerbate what's going on in the border. Especially, we know that Duque will, in all likelihood, if he's in government, go after the ELN, which are increasingly based in Venezuela. The senior command based in Venezuela raises all sorts of concerns for the future. And just lastly, on Mexico, coming back to the question of AMLO. I mean, AMLO is specialised in, throwing out these big promises, ambitions, ideas for what he'll change without actually much substance. One of those things down on the paper at the moment is talking with organised criminal groups and discussing conditions for possible amnesty. We don't know the details. We don't know how far it's going to go. But obviously, the security policy in Mexico is going to change. And the concern is how much and whether it's done in a proper manner. We know the security policy at the moment is not effective. Mexico has the highest murder rate in history, well, at least since records began 20 years ago. But whether AMLO is the man to handle this or not is another matter. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivan. Tara.
Okay. Well, thanks very much. I've been asked to address particularly corruption issues and how they may be impacting foreign investment and investors. I think what we can say fairly honestly is that corruption is affecting the political stability of the region and in fact does have an impact on what foreign investors are doing in Latin America. One of the main reasons for concern, I think, is that support for democracy is at its lowest in 15 years. And in fact, 50% in Mexico, Brazil, and Colombia now support democracy. This sends a chill down the spine of investors, given that we have elections where they do have a lot of fragmentation, and you are going to have these sort of outliers who actually will now perhaps get a look in because of that situation. Clearly, Odebrecht has had a tremendous toll on Brazil and the political elites and the business community, but obviously it has spread well beyond the borders of Brazil. It has gone into neighboring countries, including Peru, and also into Colombia, and where you have Uribe and Santos are exchanging suggestions that both of them have taken money from Odebrecht. But Odebrecht is not alone there. We also hear that in Mexico, the president, the first lady, and the finance minister, and Argentina's previous president, Cristina Kirchner's money laundering charges and corruption charges, and Venezuelan officials and generals have been charged in the U.S. for drug smuggling and money laundering. So it's not particularly a good and rosy picture. But investors do have a very strong stomach for these kinds of things, and they've actually seen these things coming round and round. I mean, the fact that Venezuela, Argentina can go to the bond markets again is kind of testament to that. The widespread perception is that the entire political establishment is corrupt, which the gentlemen have both mentioned. So there is this sort of feeling that even the private sector does believe all these individuals are corrupt. And what is that going to do, and how does that affect business, and what are the costs of going on in doing business there? I mean, there's obvious costs to corruption. You know, one is actually paying the bribe, but you know, the sort of residual effects are these security problems that you've suggested. Now you've got huge security teams taking your employees down. You've got massive amounts, much less risk associated with the actual physical investment in an asset. So what needs to be pointed out is that the trigger of corruption is throughout the region, but the results are very different, and you can see that in different elections where you have a left candidate in Mexico, but you might have a sort of ex-military candidate in Brazil. So it's comforting to know that. You don't feel that that's reliable, so that's making us feel good. Investors find these corruption investigations to be a bit of a double-edged sword for obvious reasons. One is that it takes the eye off the ball of getting other things done. So in Brazil, for instance, you'll see that much-needed pension reform is stalled in Congress while everyone is looking at these ongoing corruption cases. But on the upside, they now start to feel as though that basically there's more transparency, and that's a good thing. I mean, it can strengthen stability, and in a region where there has been a history of discretionary accountability, that's a good thing. But on the other hand, these investigations basically can undermine the institutions that they're meant to protect. Basically, in Brazil, Congress and the presidency, and everyone is seen through this particular lens of cynicism. So basically, with most of the political elite under formal charge of suspicion, the normal government has hindered and grinds to a halt. And basically, foreign investors find this fear and uncertainty worrying. And so I think you will see certain investors who are fairly risk averse staying on the sideline, but then again you will find more tolerant investors very interested in the region. And I'll just throw this in, and I think we could have a discussion about this, but China, for instance, really cares very little about whether there's a military government in Brazil. I mean, China is not someone who can hold their nose about these kinds of issues, and they are a serious investor in the region. So I don't really think that we have to make sure we don't just see it through our perspective and our lens. I think that is it's a serious thing to consider, and they are massive investors in the region. So basically, during these investigations, things can freeze and companies can have to decide whether they want to sit on the sidelines and wait, which you'll see a lot of that from, I think, U.S. investors quite typically will do that, and sort of some of the Western Europeans. But overall, our view is that there are no immediate signs that these elections are going to prejudice current or future investments in the region. I mean, the only two where we sort of would say that with some reservation would probably be Brazil and Mexico. And again, because there's this potential fear to have a military government in Brazil and also in Mexico, we wind up having these issues about on the left. I think the other thing we have to, and I've sort of touched on it, is the widespread perception that it's not just kind of corruption financial, but people's physical security is under threat. And murders or assaults, and you quite rightly pointed out, are on the rise. And this is also partly corruption related, because either the governments are working with these particular organizations and criminal groups, or they're just tolerating them, or the police are actually more in charge than the actual administration of government. So This calls into confidence basic institutions and, as they are saying in Brazil, a strong hand to restore stability. So Bolsonaro sees these protests in Brazil as a call to let's just dispense with normal democratic rule and let's go in and clear this all out. And naively, there are Brazilians that think a short-term military rule would clear things up. And if that's their view, then Bolsonaro is their candidate. And given the relatively low scores for democracy that I mentioned at the beginning, that's worrying, I think, to say the least. And I think in the Mexican candidate, he sees these populists to the left, and he's basically addressing the demands of the people as well, for the same reason. Here, corruption and security are drivers. The difference here are sort of the Donald Trump components. We've got the wall, the uncertainty of NAFTA. So that's another perfect storm. Again, so you have corruption causing these upheavals, but the results are very different. And I would add parenthetically that Mexico is the political outlier here. As Latin America, the left has been largely discredited, as what's happened in Venezuela, and also Argentina and Bolivia to a lesser extent. So, but neither of those two scenarios are actually very good news for investors, specifically to Brazil and Mexico. So, corruption plays a part, but the impact on business is mixed because, to be honest, foreign direct investment broadly across the region is up. So, why is that? It isn't in Chile, and that's basically due to distressed prices and commodities, so it's a separate issue inside. But I think you can sort of draw some strands about how can this be? I mean, this seems like a terrible place to do business. It seems dangerous, but in fact, there is still strong demand. And I think one of the things is that for business, the Odebrecht scandal has had a surprisingly positive effect. You had seen this massive surge towards hiring Big Four accounting or small accounting firms trying to get themselves some corporate governance strategies, ESG strategies, trying to look towards the FCPA and the Bribery Act to sort of look as though there is, in fact, some sort of effort to be compliant along these lines. This is basically, there's more transparency in bidding processes, and because of the fact that there's been a terrible recession, that basically what has happened is asset prices have become distressed. So there are bargains to be had across the region, and I think that you will continue to see that happening. So overall, I think my clients, for instance, are particularly keen on staying in. I think they think there's a lot of upside. I do know some who are distressed creditors, and I think that they're sort of concerned because what's happening is that there's paralysis in terms of what's going to happen with certain sort of ministries and appointing new ministers, and that sort of isn't happening quickly enough. But I don't think they feel that they're going to lose their investments. So basically, although it seems corruption has not been a deterrent to business, the outcome of certain elections could have a bit of a chilling effect. But on the whole, we think that the region is going to continue to see positively in business, and that broadly speaking, investors will be rewarded for taking the risk.
Thank you very much, Carla. Well, I think we all agree that this has been a very comprehensive analysis and overview of the issues, including through security and peace and business and economy angles. I will open now for questions, and I ask that you please identify yourself, but I have a question of my own to try to tie these different issues through perhaps the lens of corruption, and which seems to be a regional trend, a regional factor playing out in all of these elections. And I wonder how you see the issue of corruption playing out in the elections and perhaps the polls now. I mean, yes, there are disruptive candidates emerging, anti-systemic, and they obviously there's a factor of dissatisfaction with the existing political elite, and that is linked to corruption playing out in these disruptive candidates. But at the same time, I'm thinking of Brazil, where Lula is in the polls in which he's included as a candidate. He still has close to 40% of the intentions of vote, and he's in jail for corruption. So has there been really a change in the political culture you see in regards to corruption? Because I remember there was Paulo Maluf, a populist politician in São Paulo, that used to say publicly and clearly that, well, he didn't say, but lots of people said that about him, that he steals but gets things done. So this culture of, oh, this guy is corrupt, but so is everybody else, and what can we do about it? Do you see that changing? And the other related question is that a lot of the institutional explanation for, if you ask the public prosecutors, the federal prosecutors and judges leading the car wash investigation in Brazil, and I assume that other institutions in Colombia and Ecuador as well, investigating the regional fallouts from this, they state that this is good for Brazil, obviously because it's tackling corruption, but it's also leading to a institutional strengthening of the way that the state can prosecute corruption and therefore deter corruption in the future. Do you see this more bureaucratic and institutional advancement in Latin America out of car wash, or is it still kind of unclear? Who would like to go first? Are there any... Please, sir.
I'm Nicholas Watson from Teneo. If there's a deal on NAFTA, whether that's preliminary or partial, but if that happens in the next few weeks before 1st of July, what sort of impact do you see that having on the election? Does it unsettle AMLO a little bit? And also, obviously the Reforma poll from last week, put AMLO well ahead. But I thought also, interestingly, it also puts Morena in a pretty good position in Congress. I think a lot of people have been saying, if AMLO wins, well, he's going to be very restricted by what he can do because Morena will have a relatively small segment of Congress. This appears to put that in doubt. So, what happens if AMLO wins and Morena is close to a majority or even has a majority?
Okay, so I'll suggest we come back now and try to tackle these questions.
Okay, well, let me take that one first. I think if there is an NAFTA deal, I think its impact would be greater in terms of constraining President Lopez Obrador from its impact on the election. I think it would give some reassurance to investors, for example. I assume that if Lopez Obrador wins the election, he will get a majority in Congress one way or another. And I would say off the record, he will buy it if necessary. So I would assume he will govern with a congressional majority, and I think he will come. There will be coattails. Yours is the big question, isn't it, Antonio? What I was trying to say is that corruption is a factor, but it's not always the most important factor. It depends where you are. There are other factors as well. But it's a big factor, of course it is. And Robert Maes, the steel we get from Stan goes back and was originally said of Ademar de Barros, the populist government of Sao Paulo in the 1930s. That's right. And it's a long and dishonourable tradition in Latin America. I think there's no doubt it's an element in the political culture. I think there are also reasons to believe that in some places there's less tolerance for that than in the past. There is research in Brazil which shows that mayors that have had their accounts rejected by accounts tribunals tend to do less well, tend not to get re-elected, for example. I think there's no doubt that in Mexico the corruption issue is Lopez Obrador is winning on that issue, though I note that and I agree with what Ivan says about the importance of increasing the minimum wage in Mexico, but he is also saying he would cut the salaries of senior government officials, which is a recipe for more corruption rather than less. I think you can say that in Brazil, and yes, I take the point that a number of Brazilians, I think a large minority of Brazilians think the legitimacy of this election has been somewhat damaged if Lula is not a candidate. And the fact that he's been jailed on charges for which the direct evidence was limited and the benefit he received was rather small in proportion, he is alleged to have received, rather small in proportion to the sentence that he got. All of that is worrying, I agree. And it's important that there should be equal justice at the end of all this. But that said, I think I think the PT will have another candidate. I think in a year's time, a large number of Brazilians going to say this was an illegitimate election. I don't think so. I think it's still in the balance as to what extent there is a lasting kind of strengthening of institutions in Brazil. I think the signs are promising. I do think, certainly in Brazil, people will think twice in the future before, politicians will think twice before doing some things they might have done before. I think that's also true in Peru. It isn't true in Mexico, obviously, yet. And in Colombia, there is, I would put Colombia in the camp of those where one can see some the institutions function in Colombia in terms of justice and so on, imperfectly, whatever, but they function. And let me just say at the end that a few months ago, a Spaniard was driving in Chile, and he committed some traffic violation and was stopped by a carabinero and handed over a €50 note. And he was arrested and fined, or I think detained and then fined. So it depends where you are always in America.
Thank you. There's so much to say on the question of corruption. I don't know where to begin. But there's an interview with a veteran Colombian senator. He's been in Congress for 50 years, and this is his last election. He's 80 years old, called Roberto Herlain from the Conservative Party. And he said it very simply in this interview, in which he's obviously got nothing to lose, nothing to gain. Why don't I just tell the truth? He said, this is a clientelist, a patronage-based country. And, the rich are part of the system, and the poor are part of the system. And this is the way, politics operates. So once you have a patronage system, the money for patronage will tend to come from state resources rather than private resources, and that is the opening for corruption. Corruption, where does it come from? It comes from the relationships between executive power and legislative power, and they need to get legislative power on side, which is what happened the base in Brazil for much corruption. Public procurement and election financing, and the payoffs for election financing. These things are not going to actually change. It takes a lot to change them. If you look at the country which has made really by far the most progress, if you are measuring it in terms of arresting politicians, is Guatemala, which has this UN commission working there. It's the former president, the two former presidents are both they're jailed. The current president has had any number of investigations. His relatives have been jailed, and his son's been jailed. Any number of business people are in jail as well. Former Minister of Interior has since been accused of having a sort of arrangement with the Zetas, drug cartel. It's all come out. It's been extraordinary. And at the end of the day, you look at the system and you look at the politicians trying to defend themselves and trying to defend their turf, and you wonder how much systemic change has actually taken place. And that still remains to be done. And it's by far the hardest thing to achieve. But yeah, you have to hope as Michael says, if you keep the pressure on, once the arrests are made and the prosecutions are done, you've still got to work on those really structural issues, and it's not easy. And that's really the core problem. The populists come in and say, we're just going to bring it down. We're going to run we're going to govern with executive powers, and we're going to not obey these formal democratic procedures, and in the process generating worse corruption. So it's a solution which actually makes the problem worse. But yeah, I mean, we know what the issues are now, at least, and hopefully they will be addressed.
Okay. I guess trying to keep it, with the cap on, looking at it from an investor, and answering this question. I basically feel that if you have initiatives in a country, say Argentina, for instance, and Macri is putting together some sort of organization to tackle corruption. And in Brazil you have it, but I think the difference in between, an investor would say to me, is in Argentina versus in Brazil, is the independence of the judiciary and the rule of law. And that doesn't exist in Argentina. And in Brazil it actually does, but what they seem to lack is the political will to actually do a root branch reorganization of the electoral process and basically how things are organized in Brazil. So I do think that, most investors who will go in and say, okay, I realize these are corrupt places, but if I then pursue it either through bilateral trade agreements, etc., is there a rule of law? And if I do get a judgment, is it enforceable? So I think it's those sorts of more practical issues that an investor would look at and make a decision about whether they're going to participate in a particular market.
Can I just say on clientelism, actually? I agree with you. But I mean, Argentina is a country where clientelism is impregnated in the political culture. But there's interesting research which shows that it tends to diminish in areas where you have a bigger middle class and you have more political competition. So, I mean, it's not immutable. And I do think that one has to be careful about expressing hope in Argentina, but I do think Macri is laying the basis for what is potentially a non-clientelist model of doing politics, which I think has huge implications.
I mean, the argument you make is that, well, to voters is, which has started to happen in Argentina, take the money, take the free offerings, and vote for whoever you wish. But yes, it's a process of change. It's interesting.
Thank you. My name is Richard Bridgen. I'm from BP, and we're heavily invested in Argentina and Brazil and increasingly Mexico. I have a question about security policy in Mexico, which is, do you think that there is a good kind of policy model which would deal with security in Mexico? Is there a feasible candidate who would be able to implement that policy? Or is it now too late in Mexico and you just have to kind of hope for containment and try and keep the lid on the problem? Thank you.
Hi there, I'm Kiel Goff from the Risk Advisory Group. You all sort of touched on Venezuela, but I was wondering whether you could go into slightly more detail with regard to, is there any hope for political change there this year, and if there is, under what circumstances, what needs to happen for that to be the case?
I'm ready to take one more question, but if not... Okay, so let's answer these two questions on security policy in Mexico and potential for change in Venezuela.
I mean, I think what Mexico needs is, it's easy to say and difficult to do, but I mean, fundamental institutional reform of the whole criminal justice and policing system, right? Which is broken, and it was never designed to function, to detect, to prevent, detect, and punish crime. It was designed to keep political order, right? I think you particularly need to strengthen the federal police force. You also need to make it clear, I mean, which municipal police forces can survive, should survive, and which shouldn't. And they've done some things on that. Some state forces are useless, some are not too bad. I mean, it has to be a joined-up government effort. I think the only candidate who understands the issues and is prepared to act on them is Ricardo Anaya. I don't think, I mean, I've spoken to him about it, and he says that, for example, he thinks that you have that security in relation to organised crime has to be intelligence-led, rather than army-led, for example. Just whether if he were to win, which looks difficult, how much he would do, we will see. But I don't think either of the other two actually have the right answers or the will. Secondly, on Venezuela, I'll let Ivan say more, but I think this regime has succeeded in breaking the opposition. I think it's got away with it so far. I think the biggest threat to them is military. I think they've also broken, I think they came close on a couple of occasions in the past 12 months to facing an internal military challenge. I think they've seen that off. All that said, I think it's, the one number I always look at in Venezuela is oil production. And you look at the curve and the steepness with which it's declining, and which calls into question the viability of the regime. I do think if you look 5-10 years ahead, can you have this kind of regime surviving on mainland Latin America? I don't know. I think it's most vulnerable to military overthrow because it's got itself into a situation where it has closed down any option of peaceful political change.
On Mexico's security policy, I think it's interesting that you look at one of Peña Nieto's main objectives when he started was to kill or capture these 120 criminal leaders. Well, he's done that to about 90% of them. So if you look at the Excel sheets, he's absolutely he's really achieved. What's been the result? It's made it worse. We see that in the areas we investigate. We're coming out with a report in a few weeks' time on southern Mexican states. We did a report last year on Veracruz, and you can actually see how it works in Veracruz. Veracruz had probably got over 5,000 disappeared people near it. There was a series of clandestine graves, terrible stories emerging out of there. And when you actually look at the mechanisms whereby the police forces are controlled and used by criminal organisations, there's some barbaric, and effectively we found out, which has since been verified, about torture centres to make sure that incoming police officers are disciplined through the criminal line, which is then aligned with the political line. I don't think any simple paper-based reform is going to work in Mexico. It's about changing the way the state and security forces actually coordinate with other organisations, coordinate with politicians, and work on the ground. So really, if you look at the one country which has really brought down, in Latin America, really brought down its murder rate in recent years, which is Guatemala, which has basically halved its murder rate. Colombia, yes, Colombia as well, but that was in a counterinsurgent and counter-narcotic context. But in recent years, by which I mean the last 7-8 years, it's done so by creating islands of excellence within its police forms, beefing up the prosecution service and what have you. Colombia is a whole lot of factors, including whole questions of the way people live in urban spaces and rejuvenating urban spaces. So, there's a range of things out there, but I think it's got to be beyond the structural, into the very issue of how operations take place and whether you can actually get some functioning organs in the police and judiciary. In Venezuela, it's good that the issue of oil production was raised because, the report came out last week that the Russians and Chinese had gone to President Maduro saying, get rid of the head of your state oil firm because it is not working. The predicted production of oil at the end of this year it's looking at 1.2 million barrels of oil a day, which is a third of what it was in the 1970s. So it's a serious situation. But Maduro has done this strange. The government as a whole has turned despair and misery into dependence, and into a sort of Stockholm syndrome of the Venezuelan electorate. So he doesn't even probably need to use fraud to win the election. I mean, there might well be some of that as well. But yes, I mean, but this generates uncertainty, generates social unrest, generates the military discontent, which is evident. And I think what we will probably see more of, particularly in the peripheral areas of Venezuela, is communities which effectively are not officially run by the state. We're seeing that in the most remote parts of the Amazonas region already. Some indigenous areas are basically throwing out the National Guard and we're not having anything more to do with you. All you're doing is extorting us and getting illegal miners to go into our areas. You already know that the prison system is under the control of the criminal groups. It's a state which is basically not responding to public need. But I don't think at the moment you can see where the change of power will take place, rather than sort of corrosion of power from below is possibly more likely.
Carla, I would like to add a further layer of complexity to which I'm sure you will respond very well as well. What are the concerns you see from private sector in terms of security in Mexico? Because obviously this has a human security cost and the stabilization and the relationship between institutions and people, but also how does that impact the interests of businesses, or are they worried only about the macro level, or are they also worried about the tactical insecurity of their operations on the ground?
Seems unfair. This should have been yours, but okay. Well, actually, I mean, without giving too much away, and we actually have clients who have, in an extractive industry, who have had, their employees, taken hostage, etc. So the cost is extremely high. The security teams that are required to go into these places are expensive, and it's dangerous, and just the security teams that are required to fly into these places and go and do a site visit. I'm sure Richard could tell us all about that. I'm sure he knows all about it firsthand. So it is worrying, and it is a deterrent. But unfortunately, a lot of these firms are already there. They've got licenses. They have spent years developing them. So, and it's also politically unwise to cut and run very often as well. So it is a very precarious situation for these companies involved. I mean, we'll tack on Venezuela to that. The same in Venezuela. I mean, it's quite worrying, and a lot of these companies are completely held hostage to these governments as well. The price of a Big Mac is fixed because there is a Big Mac index, for instance, right? So they are manipulated to that. So but everything else is sky high, so they hide the inflation. So everyone is being pulled, and you just cannot just leave. It's not that simple. So it is a very big worry, and it's a very big expense as well.
Christina Cortez, Canning House. I'm just wondering, we spend a lot of time talking at the national level and federal elections, and obviously there's an obvious impact there. And I'm thinking particularly on Carlos, but more broadly, how does the picture differ at the local or the state level? And what I'm thinking is, what happens at the federal level? Does this automatically trickle down to what's going on at the subsidiary provincial or state level? And particularly on the security side, from a business point of view, are there kind of safe havens within these countries that we've been majoring on, particularly Mexico and Brazil and Colombia and so on, that actually are places where it is still extremely healthy to invest, regardless of what happens, whether it's Obama or whoever it is in the main seat, if you like.
So we have very little time now, so I will move immediately back to the panel, perhaps on the inverse order, if you don't mind, Carla?
Okay, well, let's see. No, I guess, the short answer is yes, that there are pockets of places that are better to deal with and not. And, we can have, sometimes you'll sort of have a blockage and you can't understand why you can't get something through or why something, and it might be simply because the company didn't do enough investigation into what the local government wanted, and even if they didn't get to cut the ribbon at the ceremony, if they will. So you do have those kinds of things, but the worry is that there are pockets that are quite sinister. So I think the right answer. What was the other bit then?
Local and state politics, if it's being affected by the same trends that we analyze in the national levels.
Not really where there's any difference, if you like, which again gives the kind of...
I think the unhelpful answer is it depends. So we were talking about lots of different places, like Minas Gerais, what happens in San Marco, all those things, it depends. But maybe you
I mean, it's a very good question, because, I mean, violence is not evenly distributed. But it depends from one country to the next whether it's becoming more or less evenly distributed. I'd say Mexico traditionally had a lot of areas which had no violence whatsoever, no murders. There were some municipalities which recorded no murders. But the general impression you get is the map of violence is spreading across the country and it's being more evenly distributed. So you've always had the violent northern states. Now you have the most violent state, if I'm not mistaken, would be Guerrero, which is obviously going down towards the Pacific coast with Acapulco. And then the southern states are starting to see increases in violence as well. So it's becoming a little, and of course, the Mexico City itself. In Colombia, on the other hand, violence is much more geographically focused than it was before. It's not nearly as evenly distributed. And I think the same goes to Brazil. Sao Paulo's murder rate is about the same as the United States these days. So
it's fallen consistently for a long time.
yes, so you're seeing the urban areas, not all the urban areas, but they're getting safer. And where's the violence in Colombia these days? Tumaco, Norte de Santander, Cali, as a city is quite violent, remains quite violent, Medellin to an extent as well. So yes, there's a lot to do with local initiatives. The local initiatives in Bogota have been very important. Local policing, local confidence building, I think is essential, absolutely.
Michael, you get the final word,
Yep.
but it has to be a quick final word.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I agree with what's been said. I mean, Brazil, you've seen a big spike in violence in the northeast in the last 10 years because of the rise of retail drug trade mainly. It always does depend where you are in Latin America. Sao Paulo, there's some question marks as to how clean or unclean the state government has been, but it's a fairly effective state government in terms of providing public goods. Rio was a disaster. It got slightly better, and it's now decayed again. Many things don't work because it's a fiscal disaster. I mean, yes, there are always safe havens. And Santa Catarina in Brazil, for example, has a lot of world-class companies and works. Has good ports, things like that. Aguas Calientes in Mexico.
Oh yes, indeed.
Small. I mean, they tend to be small. Uruguay, is a safe haven. Arequipa is not too bad. I mean, you can go around the region and you can find these places that work and don't bother. So they're the disaster.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. We've run out of time, but not out of subjects to discuss. So please join me in thanking our excellent speakers.